She was left at the church steps when the baby cried. A silent rancher whispered hope. The wind came first, curling down from the hills in long, white sheets that rattled against the shutters of the church and swept across the empty street like a restless spirit. Snow lay heavy over the wooden roofs and blanketed the hitching posts, softening the hard lines of the town until everything looked hushed, distant, as though painted on a fragile page. The church steps gleamed pale beneath the lantern glow, and there, hunched against the door, sat a young woman with a bundled child in her arms. Her shawl was thin, her dress torn at the hem, the fabric stiff with frost. She drew the baby close, whispering words no one heard, words that warmed her lips even when the cold gnawed at her fingers. The child's cry broke into the silence like a plea too small for the world to notice. Townsfolk did notice, though. A shopkeeper hurrying home glanced once, then lowered his eyes and quickened his step. A pair of boys stopped to stare before their mother pulled them along. Even the pastor's wife looked out from behind the curtains, only to let them fall again with a shake of her head. The girl pressed her cheek against the child's crown and closed her eyes. At 24, she carried herself with the fragile pride of someone who had already been measured and dismissed. Her beauty, once whispered about in softer seasons, had become another reason for tongues to wag. They remembered how she smiled when she walked the street, how men turned to look. Now they said the smile had been foolishness, vanity, a mask to hide disgrace. The shame had clung to her more stubbornly than the snow. Hours stretched. The church bell did not ring. She could not tell if it was night already, or if the day had never begun. She felt the weight of every passing footstep, every averted glance. Her lips trembled, not from the cold alone, but from the loneliness of being seen, and not seen at once. Then, through the snowfall, a figure came. He walked with a measured pace, each step sinking into the whiteness, as though it were the only ground he had ever known. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a wool coat, his hat pulled low to shield his face. Nothing in his stride hurried, yet there was purpose in it, a quiet certainty that drew eyes even when the man himself sought none. He stopped at the foot of the church steps. For a long breath he did nothing, said nothing, simply stood while the snow gathered on his shoulders. She lifted her head slightly, uncertain, her hands tightening around the bundle. His gaze lowered, not to her face first, but to the child. The baby whimpered, and the man's hand moved slowly, carefully, as though the very air around him were fragile. He pulled at the clasp of his coat, lifting the heavy wool, and without asking laid it across her shoulders and over the child. His touch was light, brief, respectful, like someone tending to a wound that was not his to claim. The warmth hit her like mercy. She parted her lips as if to thank him, but he said nothing, only stood there with a stillness that spoke louder than most men's chatter. His eyes met hers at last, and she saw no judgment in them, no hunger, no scorn. Only a steadiness that unsettled her more than cruelty would have. The townsfolk watched from doorways and windows. The wealthy rancher, they whispered. The one who owned more land than any 3 men combined. He had no wife, no children, no voice most days either. A silent man, a distant man. And now, of all places, he had chosen to stand on the church steps beside a ruined girl. He did not speak when he held out his hand. He only waited. She hesitated, fear pressing against her ribs. Yet something in his quiet, in the way he neither pitied nor demanded, gave her strength to shift the child into one arm and place her fingers into his palm. His hand was rough, calloused, but warm. He helped her rise, steadying her as though he had done it 1,000 times. Together they stepped off the church porch. The crowd that wasn't a crowd parted with murmurs. Some scoffed, some smirked, some shook their heads. But no one stopped him. He led her across the snowy street, boots crunching in rhythm, not once looking back. The ranch stood apart from town, a mile or more against the white hills. By the time they reached the wide gates, her legs trembled, yet he matched her pace without hurry, as if he had known she would endure. The house loomed large, its windows glowing faintly with firelight. Inside, warmth wrapped around her like a forgotten dream. He lit no lanterns at first. He placed another log on the hearth, its crackle filling the silence, and left her to sit before it while he set a pot to boil. She unwrapped the child slowly, laying him on her lap, watching the glow of the fire spread across his small face. The rancher returned with a blanket, thick and coarse, and placed it around both mother and child. Then he poured a bowl of broth and set it beside her, wordless still, though his every gesture seemed to carry more than speech could hold. She ate, slowly at first, then with the hunger of someone who had gone too long without food. When she finished, she looked at him, expecting perhaps a question, a demand, something to explain why he had taken her in. But he only sat on the opposite chair, hands folded loosely, eyes lowered as though giving her the choice to speak or not. Her throat closed. She wanted to ask why. Why he had stopped, why he had looked at her differently than the others, why he had not asked her past before offering her future. But the words would not come. Days passed in that silence. She rose early, tending the child, sometimes sweeping the hearth or folding blankets as though repaying debts she could never name. He was always near but never in her way. She found him in the stables at dawn, feeding the horses with the same quiet patience he had shown her. His voice came only in soft hums to the animals, not in words to her. Yet somehow his silence became a language she could understand. The baby grew calmer in the ranch's warmth. Nights of frantic cries softened into whimpers, soothed by the steady sound of the rancher's boots moving across the floor, pacing with the child in his arms while she rested. She had never seen a man hold a child with such gentleness, not even those who had sired their own. Her suspicion of him faded slowly, like snow melting beneath sun. She noticed the way his eyes softened when the child grasped his finger, the way he left fresh bread on the table without announcement, the way he repaired her worn shoes and placed them quietly by the fire. None of these things were spoken of, but all were felt. Still, the town spoke. She heard it when she walked to fetch water, when she stepped into the mercantile with coins he had pressed into her hand. They wondered what he wanted, why he bothered, how long it would last. Their words clung like thorns, pricking at her resolve. She wondered, too, though her heart had begun to beat differently when his shadow crossed the doorway. One evening, as the last of winter's chills swept across the plains, she stood at the window of the ranch house. The baby slept in a cradle fashioned by the rancher's hands, its wood smooth from hours of labor. She pressed her palm to the glass, watching snow fall in soft spirals across the yard, covering the earth that would soon break into spring. Behind her, the floorboards creaked. She turned slightly and saw him there, his frame outlined by the fire's glow, hat in hand as though he had paused before leaving, but could not quite walk away. Their eyes met, and for a breath neither moved. Something unspoken passed between them. A quiet exchange. Not yet love, not yet a promise, but the seed of both. She did not thank him, he did not ask for gratitude. Instead, they stood in the silence of the ranch, listening to the snow fall, each knowing that life had shifted in ways neither of them yet understood. She looked back to the cradle, then to him, and for the first time allowed herself to feel what she had not dared, hope. And in his eyes she saw that same hope mirrored back, as if whispered by the winter itself, telling them both that spring was waiting. Spring came quietly, not with sudden warmth, but with small mercies that gathered until the world no longer seemed made of ice. The snow retreated in strips across the hills, and blades of green pushed stubbornly through the soil. In town, windows opened, voices carried, and gossip grew as freely as the new grass. They spoke of her as they always had. Now their words wrapped around the rancher as well, weaving stories in tones half curious, half cruel. A man of land and silence, they said, could have chosen any woman. Yet he had taken in one discarded, her child in tow. The whispers reached her ears whenever she stepped beyond the ranch gates, whispered with the rustle of skirts and the clink of coins across the mercantile counter. She bore them quietly, though they pricked at her with each repetition. Still, life within the ranch carried a rhythm that dulled those edges. She tended the baby while the rancher worked the land, and in the evenings they shared the table in companionable silence. Sometimes she caught him glancing toward the cradle as though the sight of the infant steadied something in him. She noticed the way his hands, rough from rope and soil, grew gentle when he lifted the child, as though he feared breaking what was already fragile. Those moments settled into her like soft rain, feeding something she had not realized was growing. One afternoon she found him repairing the fence, sweat shining on his brow, shirt sleeves rolled past his elbows. She brought water in a tin cup, the baby asleep in a sling at her chest. He accepted the drink without a word, but when his fingers brushed hers around the cup's rim, she felt a warmth that startled her more than the sun overhead. It was not a blaze, not yet, but a steady glow, like embers beneath ash waiting for breath to turn them bright. Her heart began to change in silence. It was not the sudden rush of passion she had once imagined in girlhood, but something quieter, more enduring. She realized she trusted him, not only with her safety, but with her dignity, something she thought she had lost. When she smiled again, it was no longer for show. It was because the air around him allowed it. But the past does not vanish simply because the present grows kinder. One evening, as the lamps of town flickered against the dusk, a man rode in with dust on his boots and bitterness in his eyes. He carried the same blood that had abandoned her on the steps of the church. He was leaner than memory had left him, but his voice still dripped with the same shallow charm. He came to the ranch uninvited. She froze at the sight of him, the baby clutched close, every wound she had buried scraping open at once. The rancher stood near the gate, shoulders squared, saying nothing, though his silence this time carried the weight of a wall. The man sneered, claiming he had been wronged, that she belonged to him, that appearances needed correcting. His words slithered with entitlement, with greed. He spoke of what was his, though he had never lifted a finger to protect it. He demanded she leave with him, painting false promises of care and comfort. She trembled but stood tall, the child steady in her arms. Her voice shook, but the words held. She told him no. She told him she would not return to chains dressed as vows, that the child was not a burden but a blessing, and that his absence had been mercy, not cruelty. For the first time, her defiance rang louder than his bravado. The rancher did not move through the entire exchange, yet his stillness radiated strength. When the man's voice rose, the rancher stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the yard. He spoke few words, each one deliberate, each one final. He said the woman and her child were under his protection, and no threat nor lie would alter that. He said it not as warning but as truth, as if the earth itself had rooted the vow into him. The man faltered beneath that weight, his false confidence collapsing. He spat into the dirt, muttered curses, and turned his horse back toward town. But the damage was done. The whispers carried louder than ever. That night, she wept before the fire, not for him, but for the years wasted in fear of his return. She confessed to the rancher the doubt that haunted her, that she feared being unworthy of any future brighter than survival. Her words poured out like rain after drought, stumbling, raw. He listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on her as though nothing in the world mattered more than each syllable. When she fell silent, he did not offer empty comfort. He simply reached across the space between them and placed his hand gently atop hers. That hand, scarred and calloused, carried more assurance than 1,000 speeches. She looked into his eyes then and saw the truth she had been denying. She had already fallen for him. The days that followed moved with deeper color. They worked side by side, no longer just surviving, but beginning to share the weight of living. She noticed how his lips softened when he smiled, rare, fleeting, but real. He noticed how she laughed when the baby gripped his finger, a laugh that rang like bells long silent. Their home, once cavernous, began to echo less with emptiness and more with life. But the past did not surrender easily. The man returned once more, this time with rage louder than reason. He strode into the church one Sunday, shouting his claims before the congregation. The crowd turned, whispers swelling into gasps. He accused her of shame, of deception, demanded that the rancher release her back into his hands. The rancher rose from the pew slowly, his height casting shadow across the wooden floor. His silence filled the room before his voice did. When he finally spoke, his words cracked through the air like a steady hammer on iron. He declared that the woman was his choice, freely, fully, and that the child she bore was as much his responsibility as the land he worked. He said it not for spectacle, but because truth required no embellishment. The man's fury broke under that resolve. He cursed, stormed, but no one followed him. The congregation, once eager to whisper, sat in stunned quiet. For the first time, they saw the rancher not only as a man of wealth, but as a man of devotion. Afterward, she wept again, though this time it was not sorrow but release. She turned to him, her voice unsteady, as she told him she could no longer deny what had grown between them. She loved him, not for his land, not for his protection, but for the way he had seen her when the world refused to. He did not answer with a speech. He simply bent, kissed her hand, and with that single act gave her more than words could carry. Their marriage was simple, held in the same church where once she had been left in disgrace. This time, the steps were covered not in judgment but in blossoms scattered by the children of the town. She walked down the aisle with the baby in her arms, the rancher waiting, his silence radiant with certainty. When vows were spoken, they were brief, almost unnecessary. For the truth of their union had been written already in every small kindness, every shared silence, every choice to stand rather than turn away. Snow began to fall again that night, though spring had already claimed the land. It drifted softly over the ranch, covering the fields in a quiet blessing. She stood at the window once more, the baby asleep, her hand resting against the glass. Beside her stood the rancher, his arms steady around her shoulders. For the first time, she did not see winter as loneliness. She saw it as the beginning of something enduring, something born from silence and made strong by love. Their home was no longer an echo, but a chorus. And in the hush of that snow, hope did not whisper any more. It spoke clear and certain, filling every corner of a life they had built together. If this tale of quiet love and hope touched your heart, ride along with us. Subscribe for more Wild West stories by the fire.